Whether I'm talking to students in school, or friends I grew up with, or even people I meet in day-to-day life, there's always one objection to believing in Christianity that comes up time and time again. And for a bunch of reasons, it's the hardest one to respond to. The question they ask is that if God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? There's no easy answers to a question like that. While other questions and critiques of Christianity can be openly debated and discussed, suffering is something that we feel, and so the conversation will always have an emotional dimension to it. When we talk about suffering, we could just take God out of the equation and argue that most of human suffering is just part of evolution. It's survival of the fittest, which has required for the weaker ones to be weeded out. But we don't talk about suffering that way in the 21st century. Like, could you imagine somebody at a funeral getting up and as part of a eulogy saying, the weaker ones die, the fitter ones survive, that's just life? People there would turn and whisper to each other, is that guy being serious? Or sometimes we'll do weird things like get angry at a God we don't believe in, because it seems to us that the world should be a certain way and it's not. Suffering and evil are disruptive to us because we have this shared view that life is valuable and that our existence is meaningful. So the questions that we have regarding suffering actually make more sense when God is in the equation. And the question of, is there a God? It changes to, where are you, God? Or even better, where were you, God? Suffering has a powerful way of cutting us to our core and raising questions that we didn't even know we had. These core questions need to be asked and need to be wrestled with. For some people, their questions are short and to the point. Why, God? Why? And for others, it's relational. God, how could you let them do that? When those that are close to us suffer, it is in a weird way our love that causes us the pain. If we didn't love or care for them, would it really face us? This is the price of a world in which a meaningful expression and experience of love is possible. Because love is a choice. If someone tells you that they love you, it means something, because those words are freely given. But if you find out that that person is forced to love you or programmed to love you, then the words are hollow. In such a world, there is also the possibility of choosing a course of action that is unloving, or even deliberately destructive. And so on the one hand, I thank God for the free will that He's given us, and on the other, I struggle that we are left dealing with the consequences of human choices, like drunk driving, murder, or the actions of extremists. Some questions are always going to remain tough to answer, particularly when suffering goes beyond human choices, like natural disasters or sickness like cancer. What does give me hope, though, is the unique perspective that Christianity offers. A God entering human history and suffering for us. In Jesus, we see God coming into the world and experiencing our pain. Jesus knows what it's like to be misunderstood, to be betrayed, to be beaten. And on the cross, He experiences what it's like to be alone. One Bible writer puts it like this. He says that Jesus is someone who sympathizes with our weaknesses because He knows what it means to go through everything that we do. Suffering and faith can be tough to hold together if you think that God is a heavenly sociopath looking down at painful lives and saying, suck it up. But that's not the God that I find in Jesus, nor is it the God I read about in the Bible. C.S. Lewis describes friendship as being born at that moment when one friend says to another, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." In Jesus, we see a God who responds to our suffering by saying, "I know, me too."
I was born in Northern Ireland and I worked as a policeman at the height of the Troubles. This was a tough period for communities all over Northern Ireland, and in the midst of all the turmoil and violence, I survived 3 separate bomb blasts. During the third blast, I nearly lost my arm, and the doctors told me afterwards that I really should have died. My elbow was shattered and the bottom half of my arm was just held on by flesh. The surgeons recommended that they amputate the arm, but I believed that God could restore it. I was sent to 3 hospitals before a surgeon agreed to try, but said there would be no function left at all. But today, against all the odds, I have full use of it. I was then medically released from the police, believing I had been through the worst. But 5 years later, travelling home from a birthday party with my wife and 2 daughters, we were in a tragic car accident with another vehicle. My wife and my youngest daughter were killed, and my eldest daughter was paralysed down one side. When I woke up after 10 days in a coma, I was told that I had died at least 5 times on the way to hospital. My skull was damaged, my eye socket, nose, jaw, shoulder and ribs were broken, and my lung was punctured. The surgeon told my family that I wouldn't make it. While I was in the coma, I had an encounter. Now I know this will seem out there for many people, but in a very real way I experienced Jesus. I was overwhelmed with a sense of his love and his peace. When I came to, my mum broke the news to me of my wife and daughter, and to be honest, I just wanted to sink back into the coma, but hearing of my eldest daughter made me fight to survive and to heal. I cannot even begin to explain the depth of heartache that I experienced long after that day. The encounter I had with Jesus didn't fix everything, or give me all the answers, but it did make a difference in 2 crucial ways. I came to know that Jesus is present in my suffering, and through the full restoration of my body and my little girl, I came to know that God was bigger than my suffering. 5 weeks to the day after the accident, I was walking side by side with my 4-year-old girl, and we were both on a journey towards hope and restoration.
Now, I don't know your story or what your experience of suffering has been. Maybe it's been similar to my friend David. From my experience though, people with the best of intentions can say the worst thing. Like maybe you've just had a bad breakup and someone will say, "It's grand, you'll get over it. There's plenty more fish in the sea." You just want to firstly scream, "I hate fish." And secondly, "I don't want to get over it." Or they'll say something like, "Everything's going to be just fine." Really? And I know it might sound a bit harsh, but all you want to tell them is to shut up. Because you don't want things to be okay. You don't want things to change. You just want to go back to the way things were. People have good hearts and good intentions, but sometimes their words are the problem. What we all need to realize and come to terms with is that during times of suffering, we need to say less and offer our support by just being there.
In the Gospel of John, Jesus' friends, Mary and Martha, send word to him that their brother Lazarus is really sick and things don't look good. They are his friends and they know him well enough to send for him when their world is falling apart. By the time Jesus gets there, however, Lazarus is already dead. The family have prepared and wrapped his body. They have wept and held a funeral, and they have put his body in a tomb. As Jesus walks towards the house, Mary and Martha both say the same thing to him, but separately and at different times. "If only you had been here, Lazarus would still be alive." You and I have said that too. Maybe not in those words, but we share the sister's accusation that God was not present and not involved. Jesus doesn't defend himself. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't say, "I'm God and I can do whatever I want." Instead, we're told that Jesus wept.
Now, if you've heard of Lazarus or know of his story, you'll know that Jesus goes on to raise him from the dead. The miracle is coming and their situation is about to change. But yet, in the middle of their grief and their pain, their anger and their tears, Jesus weeps with them and shares in their pain. This is what I've come to know about how God responds to suffering, and it's something that my friend David experienced. Jesus is God who not only suffered for us, but who also suffers with us. There's another story in John's Gospel which tells of a time when Jesus and his disciples were walking along a road and they came across a man who was born blind. The disciples saw the world in overly simplistic terms and associated the man's suffering with sin. And so they turned to Jesus and they said, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind?" Jesus, as usual, didn't have a simple answer. He said,
You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do.
Christianity isn't primarily focused on explaining away or having an answer for why suffering happens. Instead, Jesus invites us to respond to suffering.
A writer called Mike Yaconelli tells a story in one of his books about a time when his daughter was seriously ill and he found himself in a hospital waiting room. Behind one of the doors, he knew that his daughter was fighting for her life and that things did not look good. His natural response was to pray. And as he tried to, he couldn't close his eyes and look away from the other people in the room. His child wasn't the only one sick and suffering, and he wasn't the only parent who was afraid. As he tried to pray, he realized that he couldn't just pray for his child, because faith is not just about making our lives better. Instead, he prayed for every parent in the room, every child behind the doors. Loving God and loving people means not just wanting God to change your situation, but wanting God to transform the world. It's not just about praying for an end to our suffering, but rather praying, hoping, and working for the end of all suffering.
Christianity doesn't promise us an escape from suffering. Instead, the Bible talks about how suffering can be a benefit to us, because suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces strength of character, and strength of character produces hope. Later on, it says to consider it joy when we face all kinds of trials and challenges, because it creates the perseverance within us. And what the world around us is really crying out for is people of hope, people of good strength, people of good character, people who have the perseverance to serve God and others the best that they can. We all long for a world without suffering. However, and this is a big however, those who have done the most for the world often have been the ones who've suffered the most. Nelson Mandela, for example, he was arguably wrongly imprisoned for 27 years, and on his release, he chose to forgive those who had put him there in the first place, and spent the rest of his days bringing racial reconciliation to South Africa. Or what about Elizabeth Elliot? Her husband in the 1950s was a missionary to the tribes in Ecuador, and on one of his trips, he was killed by one of the tribesmen that he was serving. And how did Elizabeth respond? She spent the next 2 years as a missionary to the very tribe that was responsible for her husband's death. Incredible. They shaped the world because of their suffering and how they responded to their pain. Instead of taking their pain out on others, they, like Jesus, chose to forgive, which brought about healing, freedom, and peace. And what also gives me hope is the eventual end that Christianity talks about. It talks about an end where there'll be no more pain and no more suffering. In the final book of the Bible, called Revelation, the author John writes, "And I heard a loud voice saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away.'" There's a part of me that wishes I had an easier answer to suffering. I've often wondered that if there was no suffering at all, would it be easier for people to believe? I'm also conscious that I may not have offered you the answer that you would have hoped for within this episode. I'm more aware of it because I'm here in New York City at Ground Zero, thinking back to when I was a teen in 2001, watching the news, watching this tragedy unfold as thousands of people lost their lives on that day. How could this happen? But as a final thought, all I can offer you is where I'm at myself. On the one hand, I trust God is good, but on the other, I still have questions that I wrestle with. Maybe I'll carry these questions for the rest of my life. But I am inspired by the life of Jesus, to serve those who are in need, to mourn with the brokenhearted, and to pass on the hope that one day God will make all things new.